Good morning and welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome this week regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga. Good morning.
Good morning. And it's been a while, Tristan. Hello.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. Yes. For folks who might not know Tristan, he is one of Emily's fellow reps from the town of Brattleboro. And he's here today to talk about workforce issues with us. Tristan serves on the State Workforce Development Board, as well as the House Committee on Appropriations. So again, welcome, Tristan.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So we love to talk about stories on this show and how they influence policy. And I have to say, I don't think I have heard more stories told about anything but this subject, workforce, why we don't have enough people, why people don't work, people don't want to work, they have too many benefits, they don't have enough benefits. I mean, the whole spectrum. So for you, Tristan, for someone who's actually kind of immersed in this through the development board, what are some of the stories you're hearing? Whether they show up in reality or just like, what are you hearing?
Well, so I would say even more than my role on the State Workforce Board, my role in appropriations has put me in a spot where I've heard, I don't know, 60 different budget presentations from various pieces of state government, but then also substantial numbers of advocates. I don't mean necessarily professional advocates, but people from different sectors. And 201, they've all needed to tell a story about their workforce situation. And so I would say, first and foremost, what people may not understand because they don't have any reason to have to look at the whole big picture, but just simply what's in front of them, that we have to grapple with is that actually the workforce challenges that we face are across every single sector of our economy, that there is no one immune. And it's significant that the challenge that they're experiencing, the frustrations that they feel, reflect the fact that as far as our labor economist at the Department of Labor has been able to determine, we actually have the worst problem around workforce in the country. Wow. And so we have a systemic challenge there, and I can explain a little bit more about what that means. But Emily, I heard you coming in.
I did. So, I certainly heard that it's true. And you sort of said, people and advocates, and but mostly that's employers that you're talking about, right? And so what I've heard, the story I don't hear, other than people on Twitter complaining that they don't hear the story, which is sort of the story, but not really the story. It's just a complaint about a non-story, is what that means for people who are in the labor force or not in the labor force, trying to find their way towards or away from something. And so, I know the labor economist, even that you were referencing, like, even how we measure unemployment or employment is has its own stories attached to it. And what people sort of want or are willing to gain from the workforce, and what that's one story that it's very hard for just the average human worker to come into the State House and tell their story. And so I'm curious about that side of the story too, as someone who's sort of done a deeper dive, because if you're trying to solve the problem, you need to talk to the people who, right?
Yeah, and many of us have heard the term the Great Resignation to refer to what's going on nationally, which is actually a misleading term. And so the reason I would say it's misleading is that what seems to be happening is not so much that people are leaving the workforce in droves, although there are, and Vermont is experiencing that, that is a part of what's going on. But that people have been, for the first time in a long, long time, the available opportunities to change careers, to reassess what you want to do for work, or for people who may not have a perfect match in skills or training to actually get hired. Those dynamics have shifted in a way that has given workers a little bit more opportunity to assess what they want. They've been able to be a little bit more picky. In classical economics, there's always talk about sort of labor and management and who has the power, and really for a very, very long time, workers haven't had much power, and because of the sort of spike in need for workers relative to the people who were sort of willing and looking for work, that put more power in workers' hands, both and not just on wages. Although wages have been growing a little bit faster as a result, it hasn't fundamentally been about compensation as much as it has been about people looking at what they want and what is available to them, and having a little bit more leverage for the first time, and probably, and certainly I don't think there's been any time in my lifetime that workers have had this much agency. Some of the studies that I've seen around what is driving people to change really looked at trying to unpack what's going on for workers in a way that gets beyond compensation, because the suspicion was that compensation isn't the most important thing for people. It turns out it's not all about money. And the top predictor of whether people were going to leave a work environment was whether they defined it as a toxic work environment or not. And I think that was like 10.9%, or sorry, 10.9 times more predictive than compensation. And so I actually prefer the Great Reckoning for what I think is going on, which is, are we at a moment in time where we more and more are going to be forced to reckon with how we do business, how we behave with each other as human beings in the work environment. And if it's all about coercive, top-down, power over, toxic, managerial control behavior, if people have a choice, they're going to try to get away from that. And I think you both know. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just gonna feel comfortable interrupting you for our listeners.
Of course.
I know Tristan's perfectly comfortable with that, but our listeners might not know. So, Tristan, we have a good thing going. We've talked a lot before in various places about this idea of sort of the responsibility around supporting workers over the last 20 or so years has sort of devolved more and more to government and away from the private sector. And so the responsibility for completely training a worker so that they show up like overqualified for the job falls to, private universities and the public sector, or, benefits to supplement mediocre wages. Walmart's sort of the best example with the number of employees they have on food stamps. But how much that's happened over the last 20 years as such a trickle that no one ever sort of made that decision officially. And then now realizing that, especially in Vermont, what it means for our small businesses to say like, oh, I am going to need to take responsibility to make sure that this person that like seems interesting and capable knows how to do this job and doesn't just show up with it. Or I am going to need to think about what benefits and a good quality workplace looks like. And, even in just sort of on this grand scale, this mismatch between the number of people that we have in the workforce, given retirements and sort of, our demographics, and the number of jobs that are considered sort of necessary, even that mismatch in Vermont, how businesses are going to be able to reckon with that from a business perspective of like, maybe it's okay to have everyone who works there only work 30 hours. Like maybe the sky won't fall if that happens. Maybe people can work split shifts. Maybe we can like have comprehensive, training partnerships across multiple businesses. And so as you've been sort of, really spearheading the legislation on this in the House, how have you been able to help our colleagues think systemically? How have you been able to think systemically about the fact that like, this isn't just a throwing money at the problem to solve it. This isn't just investing in our, Department of Labor. What does it take to actually help businesses like pivot both their mindset and their business plans to be able to meet the needs of the workers that we have?
Well, I wish I could say that I was more successful in that effort than I think I'm going to end up being. I certainly put that forward, and what I did to try to support the legislature in thinking differently is, as a House member, I drafted what we call a short form bill. So it was a short. The difference being it didn't get drafted with all of the legal language that we could pass it straight up and it would could right away become law, but rather proposed it as an outline. And I found out I had a record for the longest short form bill and that anyone had ever heard of. It was only 10 pages, but it was.
I just want to make sure our listeners understand that like people mostly are teasing Tristan about this. This is not like something that one gets a legislative award for, but it is.
Oh, I don't.
It is actually amazing, like twist on the usual rules, and I commend you for it. I do not tease you for it.
Thank you. Yes.
Before you keep going, Tristan, just in case our listeners want to look up this short form bill, did it make it to the point that it had a number so people can look it up?
Yes, it has a number. It's H703.
Okay,
and as introduced is the short form. Okay. And to Emily's question, where I tried to address some strategies and some eight strategies that I thought were relevant for a systemic look at workforce that could become the foundation of the work of multiple committees with the House Commerce and Economic Development Committee looking at it and using it as a bill vehicle to incorporate all of those ideas. And then within those, I put some placeholder ideas on the table. And some of them had to do with really resetting, responding to this reckoning moment with some supports, but also some aspirational goals around Vermont employers embracing what I call an employer of choice strategy, meaning embracing all of what it means to be flexible, to be creating strong developmental cultures, to looking at benefits, all the creativity and sort of humanistic practices. Also looking, another common thing that people are doing, as we have Indeed and Zip and all of these AI-based systems come up more and more. They use the filter capacity of those systems, and they often filter out people who don't on paper perfectly qualify. But in the kind of environment that we're in, that kind of filtering really takes you away from thinking about, what if there's somebody locally who's the perfect person, but they don't have 15% of the skills, or they don't have a credential that isn't really going to come into effect on a day-to-day basis, but they have a 2-year degree and not a 4-year degree, or where they did a couple of years but never completed at the college or university, and they're getting filtered out, but the job doesn't actually require it, and they're quite capable. Those systems, we have to look beyond those systems and look to the human beings. And so I did try to rally some interest around that idea. Sorry, go ahead. I hear a question, so go ahead.
Yeah, so just to make it tangible for our listeners, Could you give some examples of what was in the bill that might support, say, I think you used the phrase humanistic approaches to workforce?
Yeah, so in this case, I was thinking about particularly the small business community that often feels disempowered or under-resourced to address these kinds of questions. And so the ideas were to create sort of a small business 411 kind of service, and also to hire somebody to work to sort of pull together best practices around HR and the kinds of hiring practices that are likely to be successful, but also sort of to stand for these values, and then to make those resources available to small businesses in particular. Larger businesses frequently have the resources to have HR departments or to have access to business networks or other things. And honestly, they have a little bit more, in my opinion, a little bit more responsibility to think through this on their own. I would hope that they would be inspired to change their behavior. And in my private life, I spent a lot of time working on that professionally. And I know that there are some wonderful businesses in Vermont and elsewhere that are really trying, but that's at the edge still of the larger business sector. But it really was focused on small businesses in Vermont because 80% of the businesses in Vermont are small in the sort of standard definition. And so it was, go ahead.
Just to sort of make things even more tangible, one thing that I used to talk about when I was on the Commerce Committee is, the work that Jen Jacobs and her team does in the Brattleboro area. For folks who know that, the idea that it's an HR consultancy, and it's, that a small business or small nonprofit can't carry like an entire HR department with all the various skills, but might need to access them in a really relationship-based way on a regular basis to learn best practices that are sort of suited to their needs, to access training opportunities, to deal with like complex legal issues. And that's a role that our RDCs could play, or that our state government could play in a much more comprehensive way than sort of the haphazard way that entrepreneurship has sort of allowed it to spring up in various areas of the state and not other areas of the state.
Yep. And that's Thrive EAP, right? Is that, or did
yes, I think that is what it's called now. Thank you. I knew that it had changed names.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. I mean, another piece of this was trying to scale up the activities of the Small Business Development Center to support more business coaching, particularly around business model redesign, because one of the fears that folks have is, well, I can't afford in my business to do that. We're barely thriving, we're barely making it anyway, or we're making it, but we can never adjust. And the flip side of that is, if your business model is depending on paying workers in a way that either is not meeting the current moment in terms of what you need to attract talent, or simply is coercive and limiting, the chances are that you won't make it in the new world in the way that you did in the old world. And post-pandemic, it is a new world because of all of these shifts in thinking and behavior. And so so those were some of the concrete ideas that I had for trying to build off of that. And honestly,
jump in again, and just for listeners that are sort of interested in I'm not going to call it the sausage making process because we're on the happy hour here, so I'm going to call it what happens inside the cocktail shaker.
Ooh, very nice.
Yeah, it's a new one. So of sort of legislative happening. So that bill started in that bill number that Tristan said that I've already forgotten. It then moved into, while it was in the House the first time, it moved into a second bill that then got folded into a third bill. And now, which I don't remember any of the numbers of, I'm sure Tristan does, because he was very involved in those. And then all of that material yesterday moved into a fourth bill which might, I'm fairly sure, be in a 5th bill by early next week. And so this sort of material, which I think it's really important for our listeners to sort of hear what's in the legislature's big workforce bill this year, but has, mostly because of sort of the politics between the Commerce Committee and the Senate's Economic Development Committee, has had like the best journey of the whole year, just like shaken and stirred and like moved between a coupe, a martini glass, and a rocks glass. Like it is just had such an exciting journey. And so if listeners are trying to find the language, please reach out to someone, because you will, it is really like, it's been a wild ride.
That is almost, it certainly has. And I think actually when it left the House, it still left us 703 with all, it had actually absorbed all of those other bills on the House side. And so it became a very complex cocktail. Then everything else that you said is in fact happening. So, and so very much it is a multi-bill, yeah, it was a very hungry bill. It's a very hungry caterpillar. It was a very hungry bill initially and was eating everything in sight, and then now it's gotten eaten by a couple of different processes. So initially you asked, sort of the question of, well, what did I, or I guess the question was, what impact did this have on the legislative process? And in this particular area, I'm afraid to say that that part of the bill did not get taken up in any depth. What I set out to do was, with the framework that I put forward, was to help. I knew that all of the different committees in the House were going to be panicked about workforce. So, I sort of said, okay, well, we need something that will give us a unifying place to think about this that goes beyond sort of short-term fixes. But what I forgot to, or didn't anticipate, was that having 6 different committees or something working on workforce ideas, bringing them into the Commerce Committee to weave into the very hungry bill, was itself a very disruptive change for our normal legislative process.
Interesting.
And it challenged the Ledge Council drafters, and it challenged the committee. And so ultimately, I think that as hard as they worked, and they worked really hard on it. I mean, Commerce Committee gave 6 weeks or something of their time to this, which they really almost never do. It still stayed largely at the sort of spending money on a few critical areas side of things. And so there's a substantial amount of systemic work that continues to be on the table for the future.
I would like to talk about some of that systemic issues after the break. Emily, I know you have to go to another meeting. Is there anything you want to leave listeners with before you head out? And Tristan and I will be back after the break.
Well, I would love, just for listeners to be thinking in their own time about sort of the difference between how we, as legislators, are really sort of like held to this idea of throwing money at a problem, and sort of held accountable for how much money we throw at a problem. And that's what the headlines are about, versus really figuring out how to pivot popular or cultural or government thinking on how to solve a problem. And I also hope, I'm sorry to leave before the break, but I also hope, Olga, that you can remember to remind our listeners that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, and not any stations or platforms or employers or friends of the host and the guests, because I won't be here after the break to say it. So thank you all. Thanks, Tristan.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks.
Good luck in your next meeting. So Tristan, and our listeners. Tristan and I are going to head to a quick break so we can hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, but hang tight because we shall return in a moment. Thanks. So Tristan, just so you know, I'm just putting in an audio cue here. Just so you know, we're still live on Facebook. But I'll go in. This just allows me to edit in underwriters later for the radio station. So I would love in the second half to touch base on some of the systemic issues that you mentioned. And I'm also would love to tie in, if it's still appropriate or not. You know, we were having issues before the pandemic. So how does kind of these, are they tying in? Are they two different workforce issues? That type of thing.
Sure.
Anything in the second half you want to make sure we touch on?
No, I'm good. We'll just
You're
go where
good?
we go.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Thank you. And I'm just checking my notes. Cool. I'm ready when you're ready.
Okay.
All right.
Right.
Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us wherever you find your podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts, as well as Google, and on BCTV. We want to thank BCTV for all the hard work they do getting our show ready for the airways and other PEG stations around the state. So thank you to BCTV. And then you may have heard Emily before the break. She had to leave, but she reminded listeners that the views and opinions on this show are those of the hosts and the guests and nobody else, and nobody others, no one else's platform. See, I don't do it with as much grace as Emily does. But also the opinions you're having right now about the show are also your own if you are tuning in right now. So lots of opinions. We like those at the happy hour. If you're just joining me, I'm speaking with Representative Tristan Toleno, who is from Brattleboro and also serves on the House Committee on Appropriations as well as the State Workforce Board. And we are talking about workforce. So Tristan, before the break, you had kind of talked about the very hungry legislation, which I will never be able to think of this as anything but the very hungry legislation from now on, that and all the different bills it sort of absorbed, how it was absorbed into other bills itself, and some of the initiatives around workforce that are in this bill. But you said, I want to kind of backtrack because you had talked about how this, even putting together this bill, was just a seismic shift for the other committees and the legislature in general. And so there are some systemic issues that this bill may not address around workforce. I would love to hear from you what some of the systemic issues we have in this state when it comes to workforce.
So I wish I had an elevator speech prepared so that I could be really, really, really sweet and simple and direct. But if I meander too much, please rescue me.
Okay.
Because I'm going to string together a handful of related ideas. I'm going to set the stage with some data. So first, within a few weeks, of the pandemic really shutting the economy down, Vermont had a number of people laid off, and of course, over the first summer and fall, people started to get hired back. Mm-hmm. But if you look at where we were in December of last year, so really, quite a ways into the pandemic, we had, I think, 27,000 people who had been in the workforce prior to the pandemic who weren't yet back in. Mm-hmm. That number has come down a little bit. But what that meant is that the number of individuals who are in our labor force, and that means people who have jobs and people who want jobs, who are actively looking. So there may be people who want jobs who are not actively looking, but people who are actively looking for jobs or who have them, that number was at the lowest level, the lowest number of individuals that it had been since 1994.
Oh, wow.
So around 315,000 individuals. And so right away you can see, oh, well, that's why everybody is having trouble. Like if we're at the low, if the number of individuals working in our system is at the level that it was in 1994, that seems like a problem, right? That's sort of an initial assessment of like, okay, there's a problem. In addition to that, the number of job listings, as far as sort of measured by Vermont Department of Labor or other people who are trying to sort of get a sense of it, were at an all-time high. I think they were, there were 15, 20,000 listings of people looking for positions. For context, when pre-pandemic, we were already in a workforce shortage environment. Even with those 27,000 individuals in, we were seeing an average of 10, 11,000 job listings at that time. And so we were already needing to solve or address this question of how we support individuals to find work and how we support people who are looking for workers to find individuals who are qualified or trainable to be in those roles. So there was already that underlying pressure. So that's one crucial piece. And another crucial piece is that Vermont is one of the oldest states in the country. And it shows up in our workforce. So there has been a demographic bubble moving through the workforce age bands, the data within the data of the baby boomers who have been, in many cases, sort of pushing off retirement. So the early waves of baby boomers were hitting in the last 5 years. That was contributing to some of our shortages, but also many of them were working longer than, say, their parents' generation would have worked. And so it was sort of delaying a little bit the steep impact of that. Well, in the pandemic, we think, and this is still coming through in the data, but I believe that what I am saying also represents what Matt Barowitz of the Department of Labor, who is the data economist, has said publicly and on the record. But we think that a sizable chunk of the folks who are represented in that number are people who have opted to retire. It's not really retire early, but opted to retire or to stay mostly out of the workforce, and maybe would help out a little bit or something at a job that they used to do, but are essentially retired. That has profound implications for us, and it's something that I was aware of, but I wanted us to try to think. And when I said I wanted to think sort of systemically about it, like we have to understand, what does it mean for us to have this potentially quickening cycle of the baby boomers leaving the workforce, but not necessarily leaving Vermont. And so like all kind of complex systems problems, this one bumps up against other systems. And in housing, in my mind, it's like a twin problem of housing and workforce. But I wasn't crazy enough to think that I could try to address both in one bill. So I stayed out of work.
Yeah.
But I said this to a group of people who were sort of in that age band on Sunday. I said, look, like we've been trying to build a Vermont that we love, and we don't necessarily want to leave it when we stop working. But if we're living in a house that was big enough for a family of 4 or 6, to live in, but it's one or two people living in that house, that's a challenge for growing the working age population. because there isn't any real available stock of that kind of housing in any significant numbers in many of the population centers of the state. So that's another kind of that's a contributing force in the workforce dynamic.
So
couple
Tristan,
other
before
go ahead.
you go on, I just want to clarify. So part of it sounds to me, when you talk about this age band and the baby boomers retiring, we sort of have two issues in Vermont. One is that baby boomer generation was so much bigger than many of the generations that come after it. So we kind of have like an imbalance in the numbers of the number of people going out and the number of people coming in. But in Vermont, if I understand it, that's even more profound because we just don't have a lot of people at the lower end of the age spectrum coming in. So we don't have a full life cycle of folks coming in and leaving the workforce. We don't, and middle of their career, we don't have that full life cycle balanced.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stories around what is happening demographically, and I'm not an expert on it, but I do know that at UVM, for instance, there's a geography researcher who's done quite a bit of quite detailed analysis of what's going on with Vermont's in-migration and out-migration. And I believe in an average year, there's a churn of about 20,000 individuals moving in, individuals moving out. So, but the net it's about the same. And, there's a lot of, I don't know, I've been in hundreds of conversations where I've heard, well, we keep losing our young people. And that's not precisely true, actually. We are gaining more young people than we are losing them through the private and public universities that attract out-of-staters. I think narrowly, like it's about, it's close to a wash. But where we're losing people is actually in the midpoint of their careers.
Okay.
That's where the in-migration, out-migration is most pronounced as a gap. And that makes a certain amount of sense depending on careers. If you're doing anything that is a little bit of a sort of specialty, in many places there aren't that many places for you to practice your work. And so if you want to grow and develop and advance, you may have to move in order to do that, because where you live, if you live near Brattleboro there and you want to work in the hospital, in a specialty area, and you want to move to a different, well, Grace Cottage might not have that because they're a different kind of hospital. Do you drive, from the Brattleboro area down to Bay State and Springfield or up to Dartmouth to try, so that's the nature of being in a rural economy. And so it kind of makes sense. But then on the other side of the sort of the demographic bubble is that our student population has been declining for 20 years, and where there were way north of 100,000 K-12 students a generation ago, that we're now under 80,000. And so that has been driving a lot of the pressure that led to Act 46 and school, sort of trying to consolidate on the governance side and maybe eventually limit the number of schools. The impetus behind that was the sorry, my phone is telling me I'm getting low on battery. I think I've got enough to make us to the end here. The impetus behind that was the demographic decline of young people, but that also means that we have fewer young people coming out of high school and either going to college, military, or getting into career pathways, and that's another aspect of the problem. Another aspect of the problem, from my perspective, is that our career and technical education system isn't operating at the level that it should. We in the Brattleboro area, we have one career and technical center that's right next to the high school, but actually, depending on where you are around the state, you'll see there are totally different models. There are some freestanding models. There's one that's its own supervisory union, essentially, or district supervised district. Like when we created that system a couple of generations ago, legislatively, we allowed all of these different models. And so there are 17, I believe 17 CTE centers and essentially 17 different models for how they work. There's a lot that they're trying to do to be at the cutting edge of workforce development, actually. But governance and business models for those are very challenging. So if you feed, and I'll use Brattleboro as an example just because I know it well, but for Brattleboro, it's not it's the Wyndham County Regional. So just to be clear, and I believe Hinsdale participates across the border into New Hampshire, but that center serves multiple communities, some of whom have their own high schools. So Leland and Gray, for instance, and I think Twin Valley, both, or whatever Twin Valley's called now. I think they decoupled. But anyway, those two are sending schools to the Career Center. But then you have the transportation issue, and also some of the money goes with the student when they're in the Career Center. Well, if you're in a declining population situation,
right,
any share of student tuition that leaves your school puts you at risk of not having the resources to pay to have, 2 language options instead of 1, or whatever the case may be, which then puts more pressure on students maybe who have the financial means to go to a private school or to tuition out to another school where they have more opportunity. So you can see how that leads to a challenging dynamic where they want the student to be successful, but they also want the student to stay in their school and be successful. And that's playing out in various forms around the state. And this is a known problem, but it's another complex problem to solve. And my original draft, I did propose a study group to really look at a radical redesign for that. And to set a new standard, and this was another of the data points I wanted to offer. It's a soft number because, interestingly, the way that we track the data is not robust enough to tell us this number. But I'll explain. I'll tell you the number, and then I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean. So every year, there are about 2,000 Vermont kids who graduate high school, and they graduate without heading to college, to the military, or without what is called a credential of value in the workforce world. A credential of value is a certificate or some sort of training,
like a CDL license, or
like a CDL license or something. Now, there are some CTE programs that do a really good job of that, so I don't want to paint too broad a brush and say that CTE isn't doing enough. But if you think about that from sort of a macro perspective, what that means for those individuals is that they're kind of lost in an economy that is overvaluing college education, in the hiring process with AI-based screens and other things, where if you might have had a co-op, a training opportunity with a local business, but you're without sort of the advanced training, they might hire you, but it's going to be at a level where it may take you 5 years to sort of develop the skills, or they may or may not have the resources to help you learn some other trade or learn some other skills. So it's not that none of those folks are ever entering the workforce, but they're entering the workforce in a way that is less supportive of their ability to thrive. And it's a systemic gap that I think is our state responsibility and our local leadership, local school leadership responsibility. It's all, and therefore all of us, because we all vote on the budgets and the leaders, but it's a responsibility that we have yet to confront in a meaningful way. And so that's another area of gap. Another challenge that I've seen now with 10 years of being in and around workforce conversations at the state legislature is that legislators have tended to think about our workforce system as programmatic activities for several agencies of state government. So Agency of Education does, manages the CTEs and theoretically the adult CTE training that's required with the Perkins money that they receive. Agency of Human Services has Voc Rehab, which has renamed itself, and I can't remember what it's called, and Voc Rehab, and the Economic Services Division created Creative Workforce Solutions, which was a sort of collaboration to support individuals to, and then you have the Vermont Department of Labor that has a workforce director, and with WIOA funds helps grant out funds to many different programs around the state that do work with different populations, whether they're at-risk youth or recently incarcerated individuals or veterans. There's all kinds of categories of the government, federal government, that funds that wants us to direct money to. That system is complex. There are many, because we tend to be in a committee that gets to intimately know one branch of state government really, really well. Typically, we tend to see the weeds, not the, we don't, it's hard to see the whole forest or the trees, not the whole forest. Appropriations committees see the whole forest, but they see it from a pretty high level, not from a detailed level. So there's a way that I think we have lost sight of the fact that that system and all of its complexity is actually very small relative to what is actually happening in workforce. And that was something that was actually, I was able to bring this year to the legislature, and it was a disruptive fact. And what I mean by that is, so for instance, the Department of Labor, with all of its case management services and WIOA work that it does, works with about 8,000 individuals a year. Which is great. I mean, that's a really important, they do important work with those individuals, and that's, it's wonderful. It's not like they're doing nothing. That's a lot of work. But if you look at the economy as a whole in Vermont, employers, whether nonprofit, for-profit, you name it, employers make about 200,000 hires a year. So roughly 2/3 of our workforce turns over a year. Now that may be, some of those will certainly be the same position being hired for 10 times because they're having trouble retaining people. So keep in mind that that doesn't mean that there are 200,000 distinct jobs. There are 200,000 times a year people are hired.
That's a lot for, that seems a lot to me, given how small our population is.
So the national average is about 50% of the workforce, and we're at 60%, so or 62%, and probably because we have a more heavily seasonal economy.
Right, good point.
And a heavy service sector. So those are both sort of two factors, but nonetheless, that gives us a sense of why, for instance, if we're talking to people as legislators, talking to people and hearing stories of, I can't find anybody. Well, if you think about 200,000 hiring events, all of the significant shortages that we talked about, and a state system that is doing really important work but is actually a relatively small number of individuals, you can start to understand why, from the ordinary citizen view looking in, whether that's as a worker or as an employer, it doesn't, you don't really see a robust system of support,
right.
unless you happen to be really at the front lines with individuals who are in that system. And so that startled, I think it's fair to say, I mean, like my colleagues on the Commerce Committee, I think that the 200,000 hires, just, it rattled them, because they realized, oh yeah, like from a certain perspective, we're on the sidelines as a state, like what's going on now, and of course you could argue that kids in CTE should be counted as part of the system, and then that gets more, I mean, like there are ways that there are different programs that we show up, but on some, on that kind of rule of thumb or napkin calculation, you could see how for 75-80% probably of hiring events, the employers are never thinking, oh, well, here's where I should go to the state for help.
Okay.
And I do, I think that the Department of Labor and some of those other programs are often targeted, incorrectly so, at people who are struggling with multiple barriers to work. And so, many people who might have already been in the workforce successfully for 8 to 10 years, but who are miserable and wanting to look around, may not realize that that's also a resource for them, and it's in some ways not built for them. And I think that that's what people are realizing. And so we have a reckoning of our own, and to say, well, where are our responsibilities, to do better? Where are we going to point our attention? Where do we have a responsibility to do better as a state in supporting these robust systems? I think that question is heavily impacting the thinking of the primary committees of jurisdiction, the House Commerce Committee and the Senate Economic Development Committee. But the practical, tangible steps of where we go next, with that, I think we're probably not going to see as much of that this year in the legislation as I had hoped. But that is the larger systemic challenge. One of the ideas, and I'm waiting to find out whether the Senate Economic Development Committee is going to choose to put this forward, is actually to change the way that we support workforce thinking inside of state government by creating a new Office of Workforce Innovation that would be a cabinet level position, and would have a responsibility to actually look at this across state government collaboration. And so, you have pretty robust activities happening, as I said, in different parts of state government, but they're peers to each other, if you will. And they've done a lot of good work to improve their collaboration, but I think that there may be value in having an office that's really trying to scale up that collaboration, and also be able to see this bigger picture problem and make recommendations on how we might change the way we do service delivery to improve at least the state's part of that, while we also look at some of the major recommended strategies for how we improve overall workforce. And one of the things we need to do is that 2,000 kids a year needs to be zero. And that was what I said, is what would it look like if the goal of a CTE redesign was to have a system, including CTE, that graduated 100% with a credential of value or on their way to college or the military service, as opposed to we're aspiring to impact all kids, but we're tolerating letting almost half of them leave with nothing.
Tristan Toleno, thank you. We're just out of time, but I want to check in before we go. Anything you just want to leave listeners with? on this issue of
Oh,
workforce?
I would say that, as with all issues, but especially with this one, I think do take the opportunity to engage with local leaders and with your statewide leaders. This, in a funny way, it's really a conversation about what does the Vermont economy look like in the future, and what does it
Mhm.
mean to live and work in Vermont, and how do we want to build a robust future together. And I think workforce will be right at the center of that conversation, and we need everyone.
Thank you, Tristan. Representative Tristan Toleno from Brattleboro, thank you for joining us. As always, you may remember we do toast at the end of the show. And I want
And to
to
have a
a
can of
seltzer that
seltzer.
works too. So I loved what you said about robust future. And I'm still sitting with, at the beginning of the show, how you talked about how many people had left their jobs because of a toxic workplace, even more than compensation. So I want to toast to that robust future where everyone thrives and no one has that toxic workplace. So cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, today on the Montpelier Happy Hour. As always, we will be back on Friday at 2 p.m. on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. In the meantime, you can check us out, our Facebook page or our website, which is the Montpelier Happy Hour at .captivate.fm. And Tristan, if folks want to find out more information about you or contact you, how can they do that?
Probably the easiest way is my legislative email, which is ttoleno, TTOLENO at ledge.state.vt.us. And I think my phone number has stopped being listed publicly, but I will go ahead and risk putting it out here. 802-579-5511. Because of robocalls, I typically let it go to voicemail, but if it's a real person, I try to call you right back, or you can text me.
You are actually pretty good at responding to voicemails. So yes, thank you, Tristan. And you can always find more information on Emily at her website, emilykornheiser.org. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Olga.
Thank you, Tristan. It was such a pleasure. It was nice to get to hang out. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I hope everything's going well with you and yours.
Thank you. Likewise. And Emily said you were working somewhere, and I can't remember where, but it was something different. And is that still happening for you?
It is. I am still freelancing journalism wise, but my main day job now is at Stevens and Associates.
That's right. I knew she told
I'm
me something. I couldn't remember.
their marketing coordinator. So
awesome.
Yeah, it's nice after all these years of writing about housing and writing about what's not working. It's kind of nice to be working on things that are actually being built.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice change, and good group of people. So
excellent.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will let you get back to your day and
I'm gonna go get myself a cup of coffee. Get into the building and get some coffee. Yay!
Yay.
And plug in my phone. All right, thank you so much.
Have a good one, Tristan. Bye.
Take care.